On a dry Tuesday morning in April of 1982, 60 acres of absolutely barren, poisoned ground sat baking under the spring sun. This land had been ruthlessly destroyed by decades of aggressive chemical farming until not even a single resilient weed could survive in the cracked, salt-crusted dirt. It was entirely dead. Then a quiet young farmer named Seth walked into the local bank and bought this toxic wasteland for exactly $115 an acre. The entire farming community laughed out loud, thinking he had completely lost his mind. But let me tell you exactly how this quiet man used forgotten traditional soil restoration techniques to resurrect the dead earth completely, humiliate the heavily chemical dependent corporate farm next door, and turn a poisoned wasteland into $1 million harvest in just 3 years. Let me tell you about Seth because you need to understand the man before you can understand the absolute miracle he pulled out of that poisoned dirt. Seth was a young, quiet farmer who believed deeply in the old ways of working the land. He spent his days listening to the soil rather than trying to force it into submission. He had just purchased the 60-acre parcel adjoining his family property from a bank foreclosure. But this was not just poor quality soil. It was chemically destroyed earth. The previous owners were a massive corporate agricultural operation. They had pumped the ground so full of synthetic fertilizers, heavy herbicides, and harsh chemical pesticides that they had completely eradicated every living microorganism in the dirt. The topsoil was baked hard as concrete and coated in a toxic white crust of chemical salt residue. It was a biologically dead zone. Now, let me tell you what happened at the local feed store, because that is where the battle line was truly drawn. A few days after buying the dead land, Seth walked into the town agricultural supply shop to purchase a few heavy canvas bags of specialty seeds. Standing right there at the main counter was the arrogant regional manager of the massive corporate chemical farm next door. This was the exact same corporation that had poisoned the 60 acres in the first place before eagerly abandoning it to the bank. The corporate manager looked at Seth, holding his modest bags of seed, and started to laugh out loud. Let me tell you about that laugh because it is incredibly important to the story. It was the loud, obnoxious, echoing laugh of a man who believed that massive budgets and expensive synthetic chemicals were the only acceptable way to farm. He pointed his finger directly at Seth right in front of the entire crowded store and openly mocked him. He proudly announced to everyone listening that throwing $115 an acre at that dead toxic dirt was the absolute peak of uneducated stupidity. He boldly challenged Seth, claiming that the ground was so thoroughly poisoned that the young farmer would not even be able to grow a single stubborn weed, much less a profitable cash crop. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been pushed to the absolute edge by an arrogant expert who thought his expensive corporate degree made him smarter than nature itself? Seth did not argue. He did not raise his voice or try to explain his long-term biological plan to a man who only understood fast chemical reactions. He simply paid for his canvas bags of seed, nodded calmly to the laughing manager, and walked quietly out the front door. He knew exactly what that dead ground actually needed, and he knew it was not something you could buy in a plastic chemical jug. Now, let me tell you about the first 2 years, because that is when the hardest work actually happened. The massive corporate farm next door was busy operating their thousands of acres exactly like an industrial factory. Every single spring, their fleet of massive automated sprayers rolled across the land, pumping hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of synthetic liquid nitrogen, harsh herbicides, and heavy chemical pesticides directly into their dirt. They treated their soil like an empty, dead container that simply needed to be artificially filled with expensive chemicals to force a crop to grow. Seth did the exact opposite. He did not take out a massive bank loan to buy expensive synthetic fertilizers, and he certainly did not try to plant a demanding cash crop like corn or wheat on poisoned ground. Instead, he fired up his rusted old tractor and pulled a heavy steel ripper through the concrete hard salt crust, just enough to physically open the suffocated soil. Then he did something that made the corporate engineers stop their trucks and stare. He walked across those 60 acres of dead ground with a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder and broadcasted hundreds of pounds of red clover and deep-rooted cover crops entirely by hand. Let me tell you exactly how the corporate manager reacted to this. Every single time he drove his expensive air-conditioned company truck past the property line, he would shake his head in absolute disgust. For 2 straight years, the manager and his highly paid agronomist watched Seth let his fields grow completely wild with thick green clover. When Seth brought in a small herd of cattle to lightly graze the fields, allowing their hooves to naturally trample the organic matter back into the dirt, the corporate manager told everyone at the local agricultural supply store that the young farmer had finally gone insane. He proudly declared to the whole town that Seth had paid $115 an acre just to run a useless petting zoo on a worthless weed patch. But let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever noticed that the most important transformations in life usually happen where nobody else can see them? That is exactly what was happening beneath the surface of the land. What the arrogant corporate manager completely failed to understand was fundamental soil biology. Red clover is a powerful legume, and its deep, aggressive roots were actively pulling massive amounts of free nitrogen straight out of the atmosphere and fixing it directly into the exhausted soil. As the cattle naturally trampled the green matter and deposited raw manure, the completely dead biological system slowly began to wake up. Earthworms finally returned to process the decaying organic roots. Microscopic fungi began building complex underground networks that completely reversed the chemical damage. Over 24 quiet months, the toxic white salt crust disappeared, and the soil slowly transformed into a dark, rich breathing sponge. Seth was not just growing weeds, he was quietly resurrecting the earth while his corporate neighbors laughed at him. Let me tell you about the summer of the 3rd year, because that is when nature finally decided to test everything. For the first 2 years, the weather had been perfectly average, giving the corporate farm exactly what they needed to grow their chemically dependent crops. But the 3rd year brought a historic drought that hit the valley like a slow-moving hammer. It was the kind of brutal, relentless heat that old-timers talk about for decades. From early May until late August, not a single drop of rain fell from the sky. The sun baked the valley floor day after day, turning the entire landscape into a shimmering oven. Now, let me tell you exactly what happened to the massive corporate farm next door, because their expensive technology was absolutely useless against this kind of extreme weather. The corporate engineers had spent years pumping synthetic fertilizers and harsh weed killers into their thousands of acres. By doing that, they had completely destroyed the natural biological structure of their soil. Without any organic matter or deep root systems to hold moisture, their dirt had essentially turned into a solid block of concrete, When the brutal drought hit, the corporate project manager panicked. He ordered his men to fire up their massive irrigation pivots, running them 24 hours a day and pumping millions of gallons of expensive well water onto the dying crops. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched arrogant men throw away millions of dollars trying to fight a war against nature that they have already lost? That is exactly what the corporate manager was doing, because his soil was completely dead and packed incredibly tight. The irrigation water could not penetrate the ground. It simply pooled on the hard-baked surface, evaporated instantly in the blazing sun, or ran off into the drainage ditches, taking all those expensive chemical fertilizers with it. The shallow, weak roots of the corporate corn had nowhere to go to find moisture. Despite running the diesel irrigation pumps until the engines literally overheated and blew their seals, the corporate crops began to wither and burn. The manager spent hours screaming into his radio, demanding that his highly paid agronomists find a chemical solution to the problem. But there is no synthetic chemical in the world that can magically replace rain or force roots to grow through concrete. The corporate farm had treated the earth like a factory machine, and now that machine was broken beyond repair. By mid-July, the arrogant manager was standing at the edge of his property, completely helpless. He was staring at thousands of acres of stunted brown corn stalks that were crackling dry in the wind. The multi-million-dollar operation was collapsing right in front of his eyes, pushed to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. But let me tell you what that manager saw when he turned around and looked across the property line. He looked at the 60 acres of poisoned ground he had loudly mocked just 3 years earlier. While his expensive chemical empire was burning to the ground, the young farmer named Seth was not panicking at all. Now, let me tell you about what was happening on the other side of the property line, because this is where the biological miracle finally revealed itself to the entire valley. While the corporate chemical empire was actively burning to the ground, Seth's 60 acres of supposedly dead dirt were thriving in the extreme heat. For 2 entire years, he had been quietly building a massive underground network of life. The deep roots of the red clover and the natural manure from the grazing cattle had completely transformed that toxic salt-crusted concrete into a deep, dark, breathing sponge. When the heavy winter snow had melted and the early spring rains had fallen, the rock-hard corporate soil had instantly repelled the water, sending it straight into the drainage ditches. But Seth's restored soil had captured every single drop, holding millions of gallons of life-saving water deep underground, right where the roots needed it. That spring, Seth had planted a resilient heritage variety of field corn directly into the thick clover residue. He did not use massive automated planters or expensive synthetic fertilizers. He simply trusted the healed biology of the earth to do exactly what it was designed to do. As the brutal historic drought dragged on into its 3rd miserable month and the relentless sun baked the valley, the corporate manager assumed that Seth's primitive fields would be the very first to die. But they did not die. They exploded with vibrant life. The aggressive roots of Seth's corn pushed effortlessly down through the soft, porous earth, tapping directly into those massive hidden reserves of trapped moisture. While the corporate crops withered into dry brown dust, creating a depressing rattle in the wind, Seth's 60 acres stood 10 feet tall and vibrantly green, practically glowing under the harsh summer sun. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen the exact moment when absolute arrogance shatters into a million unfixable pieces? By late September, the relentless drought had completely devastated the entire regional harvest. Local grain supplies absolutely plummeted and commodity prices predictably skyrocketed to historic record highs. The corporate farm harvested absolutely nothing from their thousands of acres, leaving them suffocating under millions of dollars in immediate bank debt with absolutely no product to sell. But let me tell you what happened when Seth fired up his rusted old combine and rolled into his 60 acres. The biological miracle delivered a staggering, record-breaking yield that defied every modern agricultural textbook. Because the regional shortage was so incredibly severe, desperate buyers were paying premium astronomical prices for any surviving grain they could find. Seth sold his entire massive harvest at the absolute peak of the market. In a single afternoon, he turned an initial investment of barely $7,000 into a massive fortune. Let me tell you about the final humiliation because it was absolute. On the day the final heavy grain trucks pulled out of Seth's farm, the corporate regional manager stood by the barbed wire fence, completely destroyed. His expensive corporate degree and his $1 million chemical budget had pushed his company into complete bankruptcy. He had to stand there in the blowing dust of his dead chemical wasteland and watch the quiet young farmer he had openly mocked at the feed store walk away as a newly minted millionaire. Seth did not say a single word to the defeated manager. The towering green stalks and the heavy grain trucks had already said everything that needed to be said.
Let me tell you how this story ends, because the ending holds the most important lesson of all. We live in a world that constantly tells us we need the newest technology, the most expensive synthetic chemicals, and massive corporate bank loans just to survive. We are taught to treat the soil like an empty factory container that we can simply force into submission. But nature has its own fundamental rules, and it always wins in the end. The land does not need million-dollar machines or toxic fertilizers to thrive. It needs time, it needs extreme patience, and it needs our absolute respect. Seth proved that when you stop fighting the earth and start working alongside its natural biology, even the most poisoned dead ground can be completely resurrected. The story of Seth and his $115 dirt is a carefully crafted fiction, inspired by the countless, real, undocumented victories of traditional farmers who use regenerative agriculture to outwork massive corporate chemical empires. These quiet heroes prove every single day that the old ways still hold incredible power. If you appreciate the enduring legacy of American agricultural history and the profound wisdom of traditional farming, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your own stories of healing the land down in the comments below, because every acre has a story and we want to hear yours.